Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
As you know, at the end of each of our annual conferences, we ask for suggestions about themes and presenters for the following conference. It was one of you who suggested Dr. Jamison after hearing her speak at a conference at Dominican University of California in San Rafael. The fellow, the SDB fellow, was so moved by Dr. Jamison's personal story of courage that the fellow wrote us immediately and said, if at all possible, get her. For this teacher, Dr. Jamison had connected at a profound level. It wasn't what Dr. Jamison said about differentiation or literacy or standards or No Child Left Behind, as important as these issues are. It was about teachers as people, people with needs, and people with the resources of body, mind, and spirit to meet those needs. It was, in the fellow's words, soulful. Kay Jamison, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences in the School of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, an honorary professor of English at the University of St. Andrew in Scotland, is not an easy person to introduce. Her academic and clinical and literary credentials are detailed in the bio section of your conference notebook. These credentials are impressive enough, but they don't tell the whole story of Kay Jamison. There is a personal side that is best shared by her as she chooses, not by one introducing her. Yet I have this privilege tonight. Permit me to exercise it by citing Dr. Jamison's own words from an interview with National Public Radio. I believe that curiosity, wonder, and passion are defining qualities of imaginative minds and great teachers, that restlessness and discontent are vital things, and that intense experience and suffering instruct us in ways that less intense emotions can never do. I believe, in short, that we are equally beholden to heart and mind, and that those who have particularly passionate temperaments and questioning minds leave the world a different place for their having been there. Please welcome Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison.
Thank you. I am really delighted to be here. There's no group I would prefer to speak before than teachers. As I'll get to in a bit, I come from a very long line of teachers, and teaching is in my blood. It is a deep passion. I think teachers are not only undervalued, I think they are, in many respects, unknown by society. What they do is subtle and profound and quite wonderful. And one of the things that I wrote when I wrote my last book about exuberance, I focused on two groups that I think, by and large, are underappreciated in general for the importance of exuberance in their lives. Particularly, I focused on scientists because I live and work amongst scientists, and I think scientists have a reputation of being drones and bloodless souls, and it's completely unwarranted by anyone who's been around scientists knows that that's just ridiculous. But I think it's also true for teachers, that the great teachers are by nature exuberant. So I will get to that in a little bit. I wrote a book about exuberance despite the fact that my field of interest has focused on psychopathology, what goes wrong in terms of moods and mind. But I've always been interested in moods in general and what role moods play in imagination and human life and why we are who we are. And I was when I was at UCLA, I taught for many years at UCLA, and I was director of the Mood Disorders Clinic. And several of my colleagues and I wrote a paper called Clouds and Silver Linings, Positive Aspects of Mood Disorders. And we focused upon some of the fully recognizing the devastating aspects of depression and mania, that they're potentially lethal, that they are painful beyond reckoning, that they're destructive to other people, to society, but most particularly to the people who suffer them themselves. But that there is this window in mania, in the early stages of mania, that is highly exuberant, highly productive, and quite addictive, quite literally addictive in a physiological sense as well as a psychological sense. And we were interested in this very intoxicating phase of early mania. I was interested in it because I was not open to my colleagues at the time, but because I had been manic many times at that point in my life, and was particularly fond of these early stages of mania before getting completely out of control. And we wrote this paper, and one of the things that all of us were struck by was that in doing a review of the literature, how little there was written in the literature about the positive aspects of moods. And what struck me in particular as a psychologist was that we had moved a very, very long way from the days of David Hume and William James, who had always hoped and thought as psychologists and as thinkers, philosophers, that it was reasonable to try and understand passion. It was reasonable to try and comprehend imagination. And it was reasonable to try and grapple with human greatness. That we had become so inward-oriented and so pathologically oriented that we had forgotten this. So what I did in reviewing this literature was look at where is it that we have really studied the great emotions. And it turns out the great high emotions, the great ebullient, ecstatic emotions. You don't go to psychology to study that. You don't go to psychiatry for sure to study that. Where you really go to study it is theology. The words for great ecstasy have come from our great theologians, which is an interesting thing in its own right. So what I'd like to do is just start with sort of the introduction to my book, which is why I chose to write about something like exuberance, fully aware that when I was writing it that there's almost a shallow aspect to the concept of exuberance. We give much more credibility as human beings in some ways to suffering than we do to great pleasure. It is a curious request to make of God. Shield your joyous ones, asks the Anglican prayer. Shield your joyous ones. God more usually is asked to watch over those who are ill or in despair, as indeed the rest of the prayer makes clear. Watch now those who weep this night, it goes. Rest your weary ones, soothe your suffering ones. The joyous tend to be left to their own devices, the exuberant even more so. Those inclined toward exuberance have enjoyed the benign neglect of my field. Psychologists, for reasons of clinical necessity or vagaries of temperament, have chosen to dissect and catalog the morbid emotions, depression, anger, anxiety, and to leave largely unexamined the more vital and positive ones. My colleagues and I have tended more towards those in the darkness than to those in the light. We have given sorrow many, many words, but a passion for life, very few. Yet it is the infectious energies of exuberance that proclaim and disperse much of what is quite marvelous in life. Exuberance carries us places we would not otherwise go, across the savannah, to the moon, and to the imagination. And if we ourselves are not so exuberant, we will, caught up in the contagious joy of those who are, be inclined collectively to go yonder. By its pleasures, exuberance lures us from our common places and quieter moods. And after the victory, the harvest, the discovery of a new idea, an unfamiliar place, it gives ascendant reason to venture forth all over again. Delight is its own reward, adventure its own pleasure. Joy occupies an ancient region of our mammalian brains, and it is one to which we owe in no small measure our survival and our triumphs. It is a material part of our pursuits: love, games, hunting, and war, exploration. and is a vibrant force to signal victory, proclaim a time to quicken, to draw together, to exult, to celebrate. It is ancient, it is material, and exuberance is quite profound. Exuberant people take in the world and act upon it differently from those who are less lively and less energetically engaged. They hold their ideas with passion and delight, and they act upon them with dispatch. Their love of life and adventure is palpable. Exuberance is a peculiarly pleasurable state, and in that pleasure is power. Exuberance is also, at its quick, contagious. As it spreads throughout a group, it excites, delights, and it dispels tension. It alerts any group to change and to possibility. Ted Turner, who would know, believes that a leader is someone with the ability to create infectious enthusiasm. This is a defining quality of great teachers, statesmen, and adventurers. Put to good use, infectious enthusiasm is a wonderful thing. Used badly, it is calamitous. I started my book with a chapter called Incapable of Being Indifferent. And it was a chapter about two great conservationists in this country, Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir. And I've focused upon them partly because they're intrinsically fascinating people and had such an enormous impact on the American wilderness, but also because they came from such incredibly different backgrounds and yet had shared a common temperament that allowed them to do the things that they did. John Muir came from a very deprived family, a violent father, a highly religious and judgmental father, never really knew love from his parents, was an immigrant, Scottish immigrant to this country without much money. And Theodore Roosevelt, of course, had every advantage, not just in terms of privilege and money and education, but most particularly, he had the great privilege of love from his father and his mother, but particularly his father, who was himself a highly exuberant man. But their exuberance allowed them, Muir and Roosevelt, to make a difference. It never occurred to them not to try and make a difference when they saw the lands that they loved being ravished. And they were incapable of being indifferent. They could not turn their backs on something that they felt passionately about, that they loved. And this is one of the real hallmarks of the exuberant temperament, is there are a lot of people who have ideas. It is the execution of ideas through passion that makes a difference. I focused throughout the book on something that I think we often tend to overlook, even in medical circles and even in zoological circles, is that we are first and foremost mammals, and only very secondarily are we human beings. And in the case of exuberance, exuberance is very much wired into the brains of young mammals. It is one of the things that makes mammals very different from young reptiles, for example. If you're a young reptile, you don't have the luxury that mammals have. Mammals have been given a very long period of development of childhood and adolescence. And in that time, their play allows them to develop a very sophisticated nervous system and brain. If you're a young reptile, on the other hand, not only are your parents not allowing you a time of protected play, a time where you have shelter and food and security, you're very lucky not to be eaten by your parent if you're a young reptile. So it is one of the fundamental differences in zoology and across species is that mammals have this luxury of this developmental time of play. And it's extremely important, not only to the development of the nervous system from a cognitive point of view, but also in terms of social learning, learning about hierarchies, learning about mates, learning to take risks, genuine risks in terms of life and limb, of play and exploration. And we are in danger of forgetting this in our schools, very definitely, because lawsuits, whatever mollycoddling goes on in schools now, for whatever bizarre reasons, kids are no longer given the opportunity to just go break legs like they used to, And my brother and I have often said it's a good thing that, our parents really basically didn't care where we were, and they never really forced learning down our throats. We just, played and had a great time, and as long as we showed up for dinner, that was all that counted. And now you have this highly structured, you start with your violin lessons and you end with your soccer practices, and then you've got your homework, and everything is so structured that it's terribly hard to just kind of take the real risks and chances of exploration. I wrote as well about children's literature, partly because I think some of the great literature that's been written is really written for children, and partly because the great writers for children understood completely that what they were all about was laying out a geography of the mind, but the geography of the imagination and the geography of temperament, that young children and adolescents are going to run into all kinds of different kinds of temperaments and experiences, and that literature gives them one way of navigating this emotionally and intellectually. So I chose, perhaps some of the obvious creatures of exuberance. If you look at children's literature, there's very often one animal or one child that's introspective, anxious, unable to take risks, unwilling to take risks. One that is ebullient, hail fellow, never met a stranger. And then most of the children and other animals distribute themselves like human nature along the way. So I took Toad and Tigger as examples of, obviously, the exuberant side of life, as being bubbling and exhausting characters. And most particularly because it's one of those interesting things about exuberance is that it's highly annoying to other people. It's exasperating. It's like somebody whistling when you're feeling depressed. It's the last thing you want to hear. You don't want to have your moods subject to someone else's moods. And most particularly, Tigger and Toad were unavoidable. No matter where the other animals were, one of them would bounce along. And of course, there's always this tendency of the other animals to want to bring the exuberant animals down, to teach them a lesson, to let them off loose in the woods where they're going to get lost, and all those kinds of things. And of course, Toad and Tigger bounded back, because it is in the nature of exuberance to be resilient. And that is also extremely annoying to other people who are not so exuberant. I also spent quite a bit of time on the subject of Snoopy, because I had quite a long correspondence with Charles Schulz before he died. And Charles Schulz was someone who was quite open in discussing his own experiences with depression and anxiety. And in The Creature of Snoopy, who was, of course, unbelievably whimsical, exuberant character, he gave him this capacity for celebration, but in all of his characters also the realization that the world out there was a pretty sad and melancholic place, or at least had the potential for that. That he gave Snoopy a sort of a child's capacity for wonder and the child's capacity for exultation, but it was always tempered by an adult awareness of the inherent sadnesses of life. And it's one of the great aspects of Charles Schulz's work that I think that he was able to do that. And I wrote a lot about things that were interesting to me, probably not so interesting to other people. At least a few reviewers made it very clear that they could care less about dopamine and other neurotransmitters. But I find genetics fascinating. I find the brain fascinating. So I will spare you that, but just to say that the exuberant brain is really quite different. And from a genetic point of view, actually it turns out the personality and temperament are pretty wired in. So if you take identical twins and you raise them apart for 20 or 30 years and then you test them later on, it turns out that a good chunk of that temperament is genetic, and the most genetic of the temperaments is this highly joyous and ebullient state. I was intrigued by Professor Kagan's studies at Harvard, who had studied, as I'm sure most of you know from education studies, done these temperament studies from infancy to now. Some of his subjects are in their 30s. But looking at infants and measuring those infants who were, again, highly shy, inhibited, withdrawn, and then as they grow older, the same way, anxious. And then the other 10% at the other end of the extreme, whom he called the Ethel Merman types, who were, again, never met a stranger, full of life, exploration. So if you take these kids when they're a little bit older, you put them in a room with a psychologist or a stranger, and you put some toys on the floor, the shy, inhibited kids scream for their mothers, can't stand to be separated, won't play with the toys or anything. The ebullient kids will come right in, happy as clams, run up to the investigator, and start playing and exploring, and never miss their mothers. You know, it's a very different sort of thing. This seems to be pretty consistent from infancy on through life. A lot of exceptions, but a pretty consistent sort of thing. If you take these kids then and put them on a mock basketball court, and you take, again, these same 10% exuberant kids and 10% shy kids. The shy kids will come on the court with a basketball, and they will stand under the basket and go over and over again trying to make baskets every time. It is much more important to them that they not fail rather than that they take a risk and have fun. The exuberant kids will do the same thing for a couple shots, and then they'll start running up and down the court and just throwing wildly and having fun. And they'll make some incredible shots, and most of the time they'll fail, but they don't care. So it's one of those just strange differences in people. And most people will sort themselves out, again, along the way in a natural sort of distribution. And that's what you want. You want that in a species. And it turns out if you look at octopuses, if you look at finches, if you look at cows, who would think of playful cows, but it turns out they're playful cows. If you look at sea lions, if you look at any species that's been examined, you'll have about 10%, 20% of the species risk takers, and the others very conservative. It won't move from the territory. The risk takers will move from the territory. And what are the benefits to them? The benefits to them is that they tend to get much more interesting mates, many more mates, much more territory, and they die young. So it's ever thus in life. I looked at as well at the relationship with creativity because there's quite a bit of literature on this. It's quite interesting, actually. There are a lot of studies, psychology now, looking at the effect of elevated mood on learning and creativity. So if you take a group of undergraduates and you give half of them, you give all of them the same task, same cognitive task, and in half of them you elevate their mood via music or something, and the other half you don't elevate their mood, that those whose moods are elevated will have more responses and more imaginative responses, like word association tasks, for example. And this has been known for a very long time in the studies of mania and studies of drug-induced states. That, for example, in the early stages of mania, again, if you say to somebody, daffodil, and you have 2 minutes to come up with as many associations to the word daffodil as you can score that person on national norms of both the total number of responses, but also the total number of original responses. And when people are mildly manic, they come up with 3 times as many responses and 3 times as many original responses. And this is true across a wide variety of studies, and it seems to be that elevated mood, elated mood, has a genuinely positive effect on imagination. And along those lines, and I, just because of my own clinical interests and research interests, did quite a bit of discussion of the relationship between exuberance and mania. When is exuberance pathological? Are people who are prone to mania more likely to have an underlying exuberant temperament? It turns out, yes, they are. Many people who have bipolar illness have an underlying, much higher rate of underlying exuberant temperament than people who do not have bipolar illness. They also are much more likely to have an underlying depressive temperament, so it goes both ways. But the question is, at what point does it become pathological? At what point is it a dangerous sort of thing? And one of the things that I've been very interested indeed in is, how do you make those distinctions, and can you make those distinctions? As I said, I just want to turn to teaching now, just after briefly talking about scientists. My real interest was in discussing scientists and scientific teachers. And actually, I'm curious, how many of you teach science or math? Great. Okay, this is very unusual. It's as you will know, science doesn't generally get a good rap out there. People are seen as either mad as hatters or much worse, boring. And so one of the things that I did was I looked at Cecilia Payne-Gaposchnik, who was one of the great astronomers of the 20th century, a brilliant woman who was one of these women who happened to arrive in academics at a time in which she couldn't even get an undergraduate degree from the University of Cambridge. She had to be escorted to her classes and so forth. She went to Harvard. She wrote what's generally regarded as the most brilliant thesis ever in the history of astronomy. And she was just a brilliant theoretician. She's the one who came up with the idea that most of the universe is helium and so forth. A really brilliant theoretical mind as well as astronomical mind. And she wrote a lot about the fact that exuberance allowed her to get over all of the crass discrimination in academics at that time, and how just the love of science kept her going, and quite eloquent on the subject. But I was really interested primarily in looking at living scientists, in interviewing them and asking them, what difference does exuberance make in your work? What do you find its advantages and disadvantages? And people I interviewed were James Watson of double helix, who co-discovered the structure of the double helix. Bob Gallo, who is a virologist who has the only person who's twice won the Lasker for his work. He's now an AIDS researcher, but a great retrovirologist. Cotton Gajdusek, who has the Nobel Prize as well for his work on brain pathologies, and several Hopkins astrophysicists who turned to be completely out there in terms of exuberance. They've made everybody else totally pale and insignificance. And then 3 women who were not only, 2 of them very good, very, very good scientists, biologists, but also these 3 women had written tremendous memoirs, scientific memoirs, really, really quite wonderful. And so I asked them about what they regarded as the advantages and disadvantages. And to a person, they said the advantages are that science is full of setbacks and failure. And that if your experiment doesn't work, if you don't get your grant, somebody scoops you on your discovery, that there are 2 ways to go. And those people who are going to despair and give up drop by the wayside. And those who may feel like slitting their throat for a week or 2, then get re-intrigued in the science, re-caught up in science, and fall back in love with life again. And so they said that the major thing for them was the resilience to come back after the inevitable setbacks. But also, clearly, the thrill of the hunt and the discovery, the energy that it gave, the drive that it gave, the competition that it gave. Jim Watson made, I think, a very interesting point, which was, I mean, he's very open. Of course, his great memoir, The Double Helix, talked about competition a lot, and got him in a lot of trouble because people didn't like to think of scientists as being so competitive. But in fact, as he said, if you're really enthusiastic about an idea in science, and that spreads to the laboratory, it gets everybody's competitive juices running, because people can't stand to think that you're really excited about something. It must mean that you're onto something that's more interesting than they are. And it, in the long run, benefits society because of competition. People just start out and work faster and harder. Also, to the person, they were very vehement about the disadvantages, that one was thought shallow if too exuberant, that bad judgment, that people made mistakes when they're exuberant, everything from calculation mistakes to really bad judgment errors, and a lot of them had made, and that they also realized they were highly aggravating to other people. And likewise, they described something that I think anybody who's lectured different parts of the world will appreciate, is that it's one thing to be exuberant and lecture in the United States or Italy. It's another thing to lecture in England or Scandinavia. And that everyone would describe just getting a little bit more restrained, not moving their arms around quite so much, and so forth, that there are these cross-cultural sorts of things. So let me just go to teaching, because as I say, I had a very strong feeling about teaching. And I started with some of the great scientific teachers. And I talked about Richard Feynman, but mainly Richard Feynman as being part of a long tradition of great scientific teachers, Humphrey Davy, the chemist, of course, and Michael Faraday, the great physicist, that these people in the 19th century in relatively illiterate societies would have 1,000 people from London public showing up for lectures in electricity and chemistry. I mean, it's just inconceivable now. And in fact, the first two-way street in London, Albemarle Street, had to be created because the crush of carriages was so strong in the 19th century from Humphrey Davy's lectures that people were just, the whole London was piled up with carriages. It's quite a remarkable thing to think of being such a great lecturer that this would happen. Well, Richard Feynman, of course, one of his colleagues said that when Feynman was depressed, he was just a little bit more cheerful than any other person when exuberant. Feynman was as well, of course, a preternaturally original thinker, irrepressibly curious, and one of the great, great teachers in the history of science. And one of my great privileges in my life was when I was a high school student, was to be able to go to Caltech as part of a program for high school students and listen to Dr. Feynman lecture. And there's no way of describing the energy. I mean, he just was, incredible. But for me, Feynman's legendary brilliance as a teacher has always been his most remarkable legacy. But then I'm prejudiced. My grandmother, mother, aunt, and sister were teachers, and almost everyone else in my family, my grandfather, my father, an aunt, great uncle, nephew, 3 cousins, my brother and I are or were professors. We're all teachers. To teach well, I heard very early and very often, was to make a difference. To teach unusually well was to create magic. It's a magic often rooted in exuberance. Great teachers infect others with their delight in ideas, and such joy, whether it's sparked by teaching or through play, by music or during the course of an experiment, alerts and intensifies the brain, making it a more teeming and generative place. Intense emotion also makes it much more likely that the experience will ultimately be etched into memory. We recollect moments of great pleasure and discovery, watching on a remarkable July night as the lunar module dropped down onto the moon's surface, or listening for the first time to Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, falling in love, playing through the long evenings of childhood summers, because nature has supplied us with the means to absorb the essential and to recall the critical. Teachers are among the earliest and the most powerful of these means of knowing. To teach, in the ancient words, is to show. And to show persuasively demands an active and an enthusiastic guide. Thus must always have been so. Emotional disengagement in the ancient world would have been catastrophic if the young were to learn how to hunt, how to plant, or how to track the stars. Richard Feynman, described by many, many who knew him as the greatest teacher of his time, was an exuberant teacher in every way. His enthusiasm and curiosity spilled over onto those whom he held captive in his orbit. He thought the quest to know the laws of the universe was the most exciting adventure a person could have. "I'm an explorer," he once said. "I like to find out." The natural world was to him wonderful, beautiful, and an object of endless play. And he said, the imagination of nature is always far, far greater than the imagination of man. When the chairman of a teaching conference attended by Feynman proclaimed that scientists should teach what is known about science and not the wonders of science, Feynman passionately disagreed. "I think we should teach wonders," he said. We should teach them that the purpose of teaching is to teach them wonders, that the purpose of knowledge is to appreciate wonders even more. Feynman infected audiences with his own joy in discovering the beautiful things of nature. "Exuberance is beauty," declared William Blake, and so Feynman showed it to be. "I'm delighted with the width of the world," he said, and he found great delight in sharing his joy with others. "I love to teach. I like to think of new ways of looking at things as I explain them. Probably what I'm doing is really just entertaining myself. To teach unusually well is indeed to create magic. Teaching is a first and a noble calling. Lord, I am a teacher and a coach, proclaims Pat Conroy's protagonist at the end of The Prince of Tides. That is all, and it is enough. I ended my book on the nature of resilience and about the relationship of exuberance to the American character. And it is actually in many ways quite tied into many aspects of the American character. And if you look at studies asking various societies, what do you value in terms of emotional attributes, we are quite unusual in valuing exuberance. I mean, you would think everyone would value joy, but they don't. We seem to put a unique value on it. And we've probably selected for it. When you look at the people who got on the boats to Jamestown and Plymouth and said to hell with the king, they were not the people who stayed behind. We have selected for people who would cross the seas and go across the mountains. And those people who crossed the Atlantic then left the eastern seaboard when they got bored to settle the prairies and settle the West. They had vast energies and vast optimism and a belief that things could work, a belief in the future. And I based my final chapter around Rolvag's great book, Scandinavian writer, Giants in the Earth, which is a tragedy of really contrasting temperaments. It's a story of really the settlers, of course, of the Midwest, but the husband and the wife could not be more different, and yet both is essential to settling and to discovery. He had the capacity to imagine and to engage the future, and he did. And he was like Willa Cather wrote about pioneers. Pioneers should have imagination. Pioneers should be able to enjoy the idea of the things more than the things themselves. And he was able to do that. And he would look at the desolate plains, and he would see cities and orchards and imagine them and populate them, even though they were desolate. His wife, on the other hand, always was hankering back for the old country, the old ways, the old religions, looked at the plains and saw nothing but desolation and despair. And it being a tragedy, of course, he died and she went mad. But it's a great story of how these essential temperaments define ourselves as a nation and who we are. And so what I'd like to end on, actually, when I was in the middle of writing this book, my husband died. My husband was a scientist and a very exuberant, very low-key, but very exuberant man. And we both knew he'd been ill for a long time and that he was going to die. And I said, you know, one of those awful moments, I said, how can I go back to writing a book about exuberance? This is not an obvious thing to do. And he said, no, he said, you'll fall back in love with life again. So what I'd like to do is just end with the end of my book. For some who lose hope and vitality, nature will act on its own accord to reinfuse life. However dreadful the circumstances, death or madness, war, betrayal, the passion for life will surge back. For these individuals, it is an innate and irrepressible force. They are, in every true sense, exuberant by nature. For others, joy and laughter seep back in more slowly. They are less resilient. Their healing is more hesitant and perhaps less complete. By whatever means joy comes back, however naturally or however haltingly, it is an amazing thing that it does. It is a gift of grace that allows us to move on, to seek, and to love again. We have always sung up great hymns of praise and wonders to the heavens. We have joined our exuberance to that of nature and hoped in some measure that ours will be as generous. We recognize that the joyous need not only sanction but shield. that the possibility of renewal brings joy, and the renewal is in turn made more likely by joy. In the words of the 19th century hymn, an exultant song rings triumphant over despair. My life flows on in endless song, it goes, above earth's lamentation. I hear the sweet, though far-off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It finds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? A passion for life is life's ultimate affirmation. To ask the question is to know this to be so. It is to know that exuberance is a God within. How can I keep from singing? Thank you.
I have a question. What do you do personally to express your exuberance?
Well, I could be flippant and respond. I had a great friend who, she and my husband and I were having dinner one evening, and we were talking about what we were doing, and Richard was describing his experiments, and I was describing my book on exuberance, and she peered over her glasses, and she said, "You know, Kay," she said, "you're rather exuberant." And I said, "I'm medicated." So, I think I have to say that I am very low-key compared with my more exuberant side. I mean, I think that, I'm the great blessing of having pretty exuberant friends and a lot of friends in science, which I love and I treasure. And I'm in a profession that allows that pretty openly, I think. I mean, I delight in my work, and so I'm very fortunate. I walk a lot, and I'm very restless, so, yeah.
I read your book, An Unquiet Mind, about 10 years ago. And both my husband and myself, we have manic depression on both sides of our family. And unfortunately, by the time we'd discovered this, we'd already had 3 children. And lots of suicides on his family side, etc., you know. And what I want to know is, when will we be able to test? When will there be some kind of test in order to be able to, for example, in my situation, look at my 3 children and my brother's children and his brother's children and be able to determine which of this cluster of offspring is most likely to develop bipolar disorder, for example, or one of the attendant associated things, because that's what I'm interested in right now.
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, there is no blood test at the moment. There are clinical phenomena. I mean, the very fact that you have bipolar illness on both sides of your family says the likelihood that your kids are at increased risk. Okay, the odds are still in favor that your children will not have it, but they're more likely to have it. It's a very different world now than it was 20 years ago, because if you have children now, the average age of onset of bipolar illness is 17 or 18. You have, by the time a child comes to age of risk, you know, the treatments are going to be much better than the treatments we have now, and we have reasonably good treatments now. So it's not the same sort of thing as it was 50 years ago, when people had insanity or madness in their families and they had to make those kinds of decisions. But the issue is, how do you know until there's a genetic test? I mean, I don't think anyone could tell you when a genetic test will be available, but it's not going to be that long from now. Fortunately, these same very competitive scientists that I was alluding to before are beavering away in their labs as we speak, determined to beat out their colleagues someplace else in the world. And there's a lot of very, very elegant, fast-moving genetic research on bipolar illness. Very, very fast-moving, very fascinating studies. So I don't think anybody seriously doubts that there will be available in the not-too-long foreseeable future tests for at least some form of it. But what we know about manic depressive illness or bipolar illnesses is that it's a conglomeration of illnesses. It's a family of illnesses. And so there are the early onset, there are a whole variety of families of it. So it may be that the initial blood tests are going to only pick up one or two types of it. So what you're left with at the moment is really how can you predict in a child from the child's behavior whether that child is showing an early form of the illness. And that's, I think, probably the more critical point for most parents and most teachers in this day and age. And the fact is, it's very confusing. I mean, I can say that a colleague of mine, Fred Goodwin, and I just finished week before last, an unbelievably boring 1,300-page tome, a second edition of a medical textbook that we had done on manic depressive illness many years ago. And on the one hand, it's very exciting because the science that has evolved, neuroimaging, neurobiology, genetics, so in the last 15 years is just amazing. There's just no way of saying how much. And one of the fields that has benefited from that is child psychiatry and the study of child and adolescent mood disorders. However, as the person who had the responsibility for the child chapter, I would have to say the literature is a bit of a mess because it's, if you're talking about an adolescent with bipolar illness, the clinical phenomena are really virtually indistinguishable from an adult. The symptoms, the patterning of symptoms is very much the same as an adult. And the prognosis is very much the same, which is the prognosis is reasonably good. The earlier the child gets ill, the less good the prognosis. The harder it is to diagnose, because the symptoms can be manifestations of any number of types of disorders. The brain is still developing. It's much more plastic than the adult developed brain. So it's more difficult. But people do make these diagnoses all the time, and kids do get treated. So it's nothing, as I say, if you're going to get this illness, it's a very good time to get this illness. So, and if you have any questions, I would say always see a super specialist. When in doubt, if you have, and you can afford it, see a super specialist because it's potentially tricky.
I'm sure that everyone in this room works with medicated children, quite young, anywhere from 6-year-olds up. And I just wondered what your take is on that. I mean, it seems like those are pretty intense drugs for developing bodies and minds, and it always concerns me what piece is not developing because it's being medicated.
Right. No, I think it's a very legitimate issue. It's what's sometimes known as the zip code diagnosis, that if you are in a wealthier community in this country and you want your kids to have extra time on the SATs, extra time on their essays, not to sound too cold-bloodedly cynical about this, but you're much more likely to get your children the kind of diagnosis that's going to help that along. That's one aspect of things that accounts for a certain amount of increased diagnosis and so forth. Another thing is the fact is that until recently, kids were really underdiagnosed. And from a public health point of view, the major problem to this day is underdiagnosis, it's not overdiagnosis. But does that mean that there isn't massive overdiagnosis? Sure, there is overdiagnosis, there's no question about it. There's a tendency toward not just giving one medication, but giving multiple medications. And sometimes that's warranted, many times it's not warranted. Sometimes it's just, as a matter of fact, one of the major I would say themes of our textbook in terms of treatment is that lithium remains the gold standard. This is not terrifically popular because lithium's A, not a particularly sexy drug, and B, it has no patentability, which means it has no profit margin. So that the drugs that come out on the market, and these eventually end up in kids, are the ones, the new antipsychotics, every new antidepressant, every new mood stabilizer, quote, mood stabilizers, wends their way into children after they've been tried out in adults for a while. And again, some of these drugs are great, and some of these drugs just aren't great. They don't have the science to back them up. There's a very strong profit orientation, we all know from the drug companies. So I think that overwhelmingly depression is underdiagnosed in kids. And that I think that the school systems are beginning now in various places to actually teach depression as a course, which is, I think, great. Just teach symptoms in a very straightforward way. Say to kids, if you don't get depression, someone you know is going to get depressed. It's much what at Hopkins we do with the medical students. We say, depression is really common. If you don't get it, one of your classmates will. You have a responsibility as a young doctor. You can't help it if you get depressed. You have every responsibility to get yourself treated. That's the expectation. You will get treated. And you will encourage your classmates and colleagues to get treated. And I think so you want to make it easy for kids to get treated at whatever age, but you also want to be aware that there is over prescription. There's no question about it.
Thank you very much for your book. I just finished reading it, not just now, but this week. And in
through my talk,
one of the people that you profile is Snowflake Bentley, and I happen to have read the child's version in my class, and without your book, and then reading as an adult and saying, oh, guess what? For me, I'm also reading, coincidentally, I guess, not the universe providing, and so share that. But my question to you is, first to thank you, but my question is, if, as you say, between 10 and 20%, I'm interpreting, have this propensity for exuberance, and I'm also extrapolating that in your science community, you might have a higher ratio within your colleagues. It's been my experience in schools, not within this group, but we might have the 10 to 20. We might even be as high as 30. In this particular group, I'm sure the ratio is the reverse, if not just universal. What would you suggest to me or to my colleagues as teachers when we work in environments where this might not be appreciated and we might not be on medication? How are we going to cope, or what do you think we might want to do about that so that we can experience this but also coexist, but also for ourselves be able to have that reciprocity and that need met too?
Yes. Well, it is funny. I mean, one thing is that I think it's like anything else in life, that you really want to surround yourself with people who are going to appreciate your temperament. I mean, that's almost more important than anything else, I think, is that people who are going to genuinely rejoice when you rejoice and genuinely delight in your delight. And that's not a universal phenomenon. And I think that it's like everything else, when I see patients and say, you're on an island by yourself here, folks, and you got to populate it in an imaginative way with people who are not going to be, bad influences, Now that's easier said than done, because if you're in a school system, you're sort of stuck, you really are stuck. But you can create a world for yourself outside of that. And there's no question that I think exuberant people can be annoying. I mean, I'm exuberant, and I know that I annoy myself, and much less other people. People really, it is. At times it's very intoxicating to other people, and at times just people get ground out by it. And I think, by and large in classrooms, the kids really like it. My experience, at least with kids, is that they like being around exuberance. It's not the kids that are the drag, it's peers. And, it's hard to say. If you're around somebody, a certain number of people who go into psychiatry are highly obsessive, for example, really, really, really obsessive. Now, those people really don't tend to like being around people who are really, really, really exuberant. It's just they grind on one another's nerves, and I don't know that you can get around that. I think you can one of the reasons I wrote my book was I think that we go around babbling on about, religious tolerance and ethnic tolerance and intellectual tolerance. Nobody looks at the really fundamental aspect of who we are, in many respects, is our temperament, to have temperamental tolerance. To really try and appreciate that people are different, and that nature has dealt us a very diverse deck for a reason. You really don't want everybody taking risks. You don't want everybody being conservative. You want a mix of temperaments. And so you want to try and keep that in. Now, that's an intellectual argument that's hard to live with.
Thank you. I think what I'll do is continue to be with the kids in that sense, and kind of
Buy a puppy.
yeah, or hug my husband more. Thanks.
Thank you.